This is Window on the East, a podcast from bne IntelliNews. Subscribe at bne.eu.
Welcome to another edition of bne IntelliNews' A Window on the East. Today I'm joined by Arasha Azizi, doctor now. Yes, you recently got your PhD and author of several books on Iran. September 16th is the one-year anniversary of the death of Mahsa Amini, who died at the hands of Iran's so-called morality police. Arash has spoken extensively on the topic, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Can you tell us more about what happened in the past 12 months?
So in September of 2022, as you mentioned, Mahsa Amini, a young Iranian woman from the Kurdish town of Saqqez in western Iran, was traveling in Tehran, for her birthday. She was a week before her 22nd birthday when she got off a metro station. And in Iran, there's this program called the Guidance Patrol, or sometimes translated as Moral Police, as you said. So the Moral Security Division of the police puts these vans all around the different parts of Tehran and other cities to arrest women who are supposedly having what they call improper hijab. Now, hijab, of course, is a wailing in Islamic tradition, and Iran is the only country in the world now with the addition of the unrecognized Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which enforces it. It forces all women to cover their hair and their hands and their arms and basically all their body. So Mahsa was one of the women who came out of this Martyr Haqqani metro station in somewhere in Tehran, in northern Tehran, and she was arrested by this morality police vans, and she was thrown into a van. And this happens a lot, but and a lot of women are thrown in these vans, they're beaten up, and this is very normal. But this time, the beating was so bad that she went into a coma, and she died a few days later. And this led to, it was a spark that really lit the fire and led to the largest street protest movement, you can say, in the history of the Islamic Republic since 1979. And I think the reason for that is that a lot of Iranians just felt so much for the wanton injustice and the arbitrary rule of this goons of the regime, these men with guns who decide everything in the society, including whether someone can live or die, because they don't like how, because effectively they don't like how she's dressing up.
And upon her death, there were protests across the country, which took several months before the regime were able to quash them. Do you believe that potentially there is another spark on its way, or have they successfully petered it out?
So in the last few months, as I said, this was the largest, most serious challenge the Islamic Republic has faced in many ways back in 1979. So what happened in the beginning of the movement, 2022, was that immediately you had tons of demonstrations in Tehran, in Kurdistan province, all over Iran. Then it spread to Sistan and Baluchistan, the southeast, all over the country. It's very important. The geographical and demographical expanse of this movement was without precedence, really. We've had movements before in 2009, in 2017, in 2019, in 2020, but none of them really had this kind of expanse. And the slogans were very radical. In fact, one of the earliest slogans was, "Don't call this a protest, this is a revolution." The slogan "Woman, Life, Freedom," borrowed from left-wing Kurdish movements, quickly came to really capture the kind of revolutionary demands that the Iranian people had. So at the same time, while the protests really, as I said, put the regime on the back burner for a while, various methods were picked for the first time in a long time. Serious questions of what could transition from the Islamic Republic look like were discussed. We had an attempt in general strike in December. There was a 3-day strike, which led to, I would say thousands of Iranians not going to work, but nothing on the level of what an actual general strike should look like. So I think what we had during this last 12 months was that Iranians posed the question of what could the overthrow of the regime look like, but also they came to realize that it's not an easy task. The most important and the most pernicious wrong belief, unfortunately, that exists in Iran and existed certainly in the beginning of the movement was that this was a good thing, that this was a leaderless movement because it was a horizontal movement. The kind of what I really believe silly and, as I said, pernicious belief that has also existed in other countries. There's no single revolution in world history that has ever been successful in overthrowing anything, achieving anything without a degree of organizational leadership. Now, maybe not personal leadership or individual leadership, although that really helps actually, but the level of organizational leadership. So I think the movement in Iran, if you will, this movement to get rid of the regime, also had a sobering moment. It found out that even with monumental sacrifices, really inspiring scenes of thousands of women burning their hijabs, coming out, fighting the cops on the street, it's obviously not enough to affect the political change. So whether the movement will rise again or not, I think it will. I think even the strategists of the regime themselves confess that none of the contradictions that gave rise and gave birth to the movement in 2022 have been solved. The economic condition continues. Iran's international isolation, which has immense economic consequences, continues. The massive repression continues. The disenfranchisement and making women second-class citizens, which is half of Iran, continues. So all of this means that there is still material for protest, and there will be protest. However, it is also a reality that Iranian civil society has been rather successfully destroyed by the Islamic Republic. Iranians don't have organizations inside the country. Unfortunately, the millions of Iranians abroad who do enjoy democratic freedoms have failed rather miserably to build any institution.
I just wanted to tap into that because you were, at the time, heavily involved with the outside discourse on the situation in Iran. And there were several different groups trying to merge together, led by the former Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi. But it all fell apart. Can you go into more detail about that? Because you've mentioned that in other interviews recently.
So as I said, inside Iran, there are many important, courageous activists, women's rights activists, labor activists, trade unionists, writers, who I think could potentially put together a large number of people. But they're in prison. Anybody who could organize anything in Iran is in prison. So that's why a lot of people were looking to Iranians abroad who won't go to prison if they organize something, so that they could organize a alternative to the regime, or at least the beginnings of an alternative. So you had a few well-known figures. There was Reza Pahlavi, there was journalist and activist Mahsa Amini, who's been an anti-compulsory hijab activist for years and a very sort of influential activist. There was actresses like Nazanin Boniadi and Golshifteh Farahani, who were well-known figures in Iran, who've done great human rights work for a long time. There was Ali Karimi, the footballer, who had obviously a mass following. He's one of the best non-footballers in Iran. There was Shir Nebadi, the Nobel Peace Laureate. There was Hamed Esmailion, a dentist and a writer who has been a justice activist for some years after he lost his wife and daughter when the Islamic regime shot down a passenger plane.
Yeah, PS752.
So these people that I named, 8 of them, came together from early 2023. There were some secret meetings. In early 2023, they sort of published a joint tweet. Then in February, they met in a press conference in Georgetown University. They had been invited by Georgetown. They had this press conference, and they promised that they'll publish a charter within a month. And they did in March. But unfortunately, as soon as this charter was published, there was a lot of fights between the followers of these different figures. Obviously, Pahlavi rather looms large. He is the best-known figure amongst them. He also has a lot of people who act in his name and his supporters. But clearly, a lot of them were not happy with Pahlavi joining with center-left figures, like the ones I mentioned. I also mentioned Abdullah Muhtadi, the leader of Komala Party of Iranian Kurdistan, which is the observer party of the Socialist International, sort of a left-wing Kurdish party. He was also part of the coalition. A lot of them were unhappy that he was joining with, as I said, this center-left and our leftist figures. And at any rate, in what was quickly turned into a rather sad spectacle and a fiasco, what they had formed, this thing was called Alliance for Freedom and Democracy in Iran, or they called it sort of the Mahsa Council after Mahsa Amini. This collapsed in a matter of weeks, not even a matter of months, which was sort of really shocking. And of course, the best news for the regime. I mean, if you're the regime, this is the best propaganda victory you can have. You can say, look, even when opponents want to come together, they can't hold an organization again, not for 6 months, not for 6 years, but they could hardly hold it for 6 weeks, right?
The reason it fell apart, was it because of Pahlavi himself? Because was he the outsized figure?
It would be easy. It would be easy to blame it on one person, right? Although I do think you're right. There was outsized figure, and that he has some of the blame. But it's not him alone, right? It's the reality. I'll say a couple of things. First of all, it's about them working together, right? And being able to compromise. A lot of, for example, Mahsi is a friend, and I have a lot of respect for her. But she's an activist, right? And then the activist, the only thing you don't do is compromise, right? You attack, you have a cause, you defend it. Whereas politics is the opposite of activism in this way. It's all about the compromise, right? It's all about you should be ready to shelve some of your demands. And so some of the supporters of Mahsi and others also were also attacking, Pahlavi, or other figures. And let me add another thing. Okay, let's say Pahlavi is the problem and his supporters are the problem. Well, why don't the rest of them form something together? And actually, the other thing I should say, none of these figures, none of them have built anything. Not a single organization, not a single student organization, not a single, when I say organization, I mean something more than 8 people, right? None of them have done so. And, this isn't even about, let's say Pahlavis believe that the rest of us are terrible and are leftist and they shouldn't work with us. Well, form an organization for yourself, right? Form an Iranian organization, supporters of Pahlavi political party or organization that you can say, okay, it has 10,000 members, right? Unfortunately, this doesn't exist on any level. And I think it's not about just blaming one particular figure. I think it's that we lack so far a political culture, really, certainly within the opposition. And I think pernicious, as I said, idiotic ideas, I'm sorry to speak clearly, of that, basically having a political party is a taboo, that it's a good thing when a movement is not, doesn't have leadership, doesn't have organization, have been popular. Let me give you an example. Ashkan Khatibi, great singer, a supporter of the movement, I like his work a lot. Recently, he shows up to Venice Film Festival, and, there was a sort of a controversy because a Palestinian actress sort of brought a Palestine flag, so there was a bit of controversy about it. I don't even want to enter the controversy, but Ashkan Khatibi, in order to answer as part of this, he makes a couple of tweets, in one of which he says, well, politics is beneath me as an artist. I think the reason I bring it up is that it entirely encapsulates the kind of attitude that a lot of Iranian activists have had toward politics, right? They basically believe it's beneath them to join an organization and do the political life that, whether in Britain or in any other country, you have different political parties, you have different political organizations. So long as we don't change this, we have no chance of wanting to replace the regime.
You touch on a really important topic there and I don't think it's just Iran. If you look in several different countries, there's been an aversion to people joining into political movements, parties. There's a new book out this week by Rory Stewart, who spent time in Iran and, was an MP here. And he said, the average age cohort of people of his Conservative Party at the time was 60 years plus. And it could be for several reasons. It could be the internet. It could be, people just wanting a normal life. That, politics, in a sense, is, you'll burn your fingers.
No, so absolutely. I think you have an absolute point, and I think it's definitely not just Iran. In fact, there's another book coming out soon by Vincent Bevins, I don't know what the shape of the book would be, but I think it's about these different movements. He's basically talking about there were tons of street movements, none of which actually leads to much change. And he wants to discuss why. And there's been other work on this as well. And it's interesting to talk about in democratic countries. That's a little bit different, right? It's a bit of a different context, although I do think he's actually related. In Britain, for example, a few years ago, whenever you see big movements like, let's say the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, whatever we think of him, positively or negatively, but
or even Brexit,
or Brexit, yes. So, but I mean, with Corbyn, things happened when people joined the political party, and with Brexit, actually, you can say the existence of UKIP as a political vehicle was very important, right? And was able to really capture things, and of course, sort of.
But what's interesting is they came at the same time.
That's right. Yeah. So that's right. So you can have, but I mean, as I said, so democratic countries is a slightly different context. But if you want to have, if you want to make societal change, you cannot do it via hashtags. And I think this sounds something very obvious. I don't think it's obvious at all. I think a lot of Iranians and a lot of other people precisely thought they could do it with hashtags. And it would be nice. You don't have to go to meetings. Anyone who's been involved in politics hates meetings. Right? You don't have to do anything. You don't have to gather. You don't have to compromise over your differences, most importantly. You can just say some vague things like, I love life, I love women, I love freedom online, and it would lead to change. Unfortunately, it's just not how it works. And yes, there are other countries. Let's say the Black Lives Matter movement. What did Black Lives Matter movement here resulted to sort of organizationally? Nothing, unfortunately. When you compare it to the civil rights struggles in the 1960s, there were tons of organizations. They had very clear agendas, right? And they got them. They passed the Voting Rights Act. They passed the Civil Rights Act. They did all these other things. Whereas Black Lives Matter movement, unfortunately, right, had no organizational result, if you will, nor a clear agenda, or even pretense at a clear agenda, right?
Do you think that these internet-led movements basically empty out quickly because they're not genuine grassroots movements?
On the question of the relationship between social media and movements, of course, social media is, in a way, first of all, it's just part of our lives now. It's a technology we use, just like we used newspapers and radio and television before. But I think it is good to ask, so in terms of, for example, Black Lives Matter, there was tens of thousands of people coming on the street, and a lot of demonstrations. I was a part of some of these demonstrations. It wasn't really social media led. It wasn't really social media led. Like people would, there was word of mouth. There was a local community. You knew where to come out. In particular in the smaller cities. But nevertheless, you can say a sort of a social media mentality has really affected a lot of social movements around the world.
It's a global thing, isn't it?
Absolutely, right? So, and I think the idea is, so the problematic is that a lot of people genuinely seem to think that if they quote unquote raise awareness about something that it's a phrase that I really hate, by the way, because raising awareness has never led to any change. The idea that if only enough people would hear about something, it would magically change. It just doesn't stand the test of reason, right? Sure, it's good. It's part of your strategy, right? Like spreading word about anything. If you're selling gum, you need to spread awareness, but you also need to have a distribution network, and you need to make good gum, right? So if you only put the advertisements out, but don't do any other work, obviously you're not going to be successful. The same thing with political movements, right? So I think there is this misplaced belief that somehow spreading word about something and shouting about it on social media and all these very performative ways of showing solidarity would lead to change. What we need instead is political strategy. You need a strategy wherever you do anything, right? But somehow it looks like a lot of people have convinced themselves that if they want to change the world, and they can just do it without any strategy, with a tweet or with simply not thinking about, or with thinking they're right. I mean, I think that's a big part of it. It's like the idea is that you're on the right side of history, so it doesn't matter if people don't support you. And people will look back and say, well, for example, there was a struggle against apartheid, and there was a time if you spoke against apartheid South Africa, no one supported you, but then things happened. But the question is, okay, how did the apartheid actually was overthrown? By massive amounts of political strategizing and compromise by the way, that's necessary, right? So I think that's what is lacking. Politics is what is lacking. That if you want to change the world, you need to be engaged in politics. There's no other way, right? There's no other way. There's no, you can have movements from below that shake things, but when the actual change happens, there needs to be a political element. Politics doesn't mean, some people put on a suit and like conspire with each other, right? It means shifting power in society, and it means involving citizenry, which is the other important thing. So to go back to Iran, this lack of organization is no joke. If you look at 1970s, for example, right? Iranian diaspora was 10 times much smaller, right? But there existed organizations at every level. Iranian Student Association in the United States organized, it was, if you were Iranian student, you had likely been in an ISA event, anyone, right? Whereas today we have tens of thousands of students. In Toronto alone, York University has 4,000 Iranian students. This is something any organizer would have dreamt of. And there is rather a consensus, if you will, amongst large numbers of Iranians that they hate this regime. However, there's very little organizing. And there's very little political strategizing. So that's what needs to change, right? And it will, people like Hossein Bastani in Iran have been writing about this. Jack Goldstone, as someone who is sort of an expert on revolutions, have written on Iran and given interviews to Iranian outlets about this. So that's something that we need to wake up to. That if you want political change, you're going to have to need to do political work.
The incumbent administration of Ebrahim Raisi, has been recently running around the world signing contracts and deals. It's become a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a security-led pact by China. It's also, in the past week, become a member of the BRICS group of countries, and it has a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union, led by Russia. The administration and the government in Iran is quite clearly aware that it's been backed into a corner in terms of sanctions, and they are looking for a route out. So this is their, I assume their logical route out by teaming up with China, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. These are the non-aligned countries traditionally. But do you think that is any way a way to placate the people and try and revive the economy, which has been suffering terribly for several years now? The rial is at a historic low of 500,000 rials to $1. So, do you think that they've bought time?
I mean, they're trying. I don't think it has worked yet because the Iranian economy has much more important problems, and because the degree of gap between the regime and the people is very, very large. So it won't be so easy to fill it, right? If you want to economically buy off a population, you need to do much better than like joining a couple of organizations. But it is true that the regime has definitely lessened its international isolation. Most importantly, it reestablished ties with Saudi Arabia, which is a very important feat. In fact, it's now on the verge of possibly doing so with even Egypt and Jordan. Expanding ties with Egypt has been on the agenda for many years, different administrations. But I think it's, if Iran has a relationship with Saudi Arabia, it has a relationship with United Arab Emirates, it has a relationship with everybody in the region except Israel, why wouldn't it have relations with Egypt? And with Jordan is trickier, but I think there's actually some sort of diplomatic relations already, but, to expand them. And look, this tells us a couple of things. First of all, sanctions, there is a limit as to, what they can do, right? Especially as you start sanctioning more and more countries. If you sanction these countries, well, they can work together, right?
There's a tipping point.
Exactly, right? So now you have Russia, you have Iran, there's some restrictions on China, there's, of course, Venezuela, there's Belarus, right? So they can sort of trade with each other a little bit. Now, basically that has been what's going on for a long time. And let's be real, the sanction regime on Iran is pretty extensive, right? But even at its worst under Trump, it never led to Iran becoming a failed state, right? It's simple. Like there was never a time where people couldn't find bread in the stores, right? This didn't come, and it won't come because it's almost impossible for something like that to happen, right? I mean, I guess if you really try and if you put the most extensive thing, you can try to have that. The consequences of that will be unpredictable.
But the Americans can't watch the borders of Iran.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and Iran is a country of 80 million. It's a country of much talent. It's a country of if you're a ruler of Iran and you've kept the rule, you can find enough people that can help you or circumvent some sanctions, right? With Turkey, with Russia, which is basically what has happened throughout all these years, right? Iran never became like even Venezuela, right? I mean, Venezuela, you had a failed state situation, which, by the way, in Venezuela, Iranians need to learn lessons from it. Venezuela, you had, the 20% of the population left. You really had, no toilet papers anywhere, right? You really couldn't get the most basic goods. And you had a rival government whose president was in Caracas, by the way, not in Washington, D.C., and was recognized not just by the United States, but by half of Latin American countries. It still didn't lead to change because, you need to have a political strategy. And again, what was the political strategy? That Maduro would somehow pack up his bags and leave? Well, it didn't happen, right? So in terms of the Islamic Republic expanding its diplomatic ties, I think, as I said, it shows there's a limit to how effective sanctions are. And the other thing is, countries of the world, they have a variety of interests. Sure, they don't like the Islamic Republic, right? But they also know they have to deal with it, basically, if it's in charge. In fact, even the unrecognized Taliban regime, it's really only unrecognized in name. Everyone hates the Taliban. They think they're reprehensible.
Oh, the Chinese today they have an ambassador for the first time.
Yeah, there we go. And so the unrecognized Taliban regime has extensive relations with, I think they've had diplomatic meetings with 70 countries, right? Which is much more than some other countries can do. And of course, somewhere like North Korea is another example of somewhere that is there recognized, is a member of the UN, has extensive diplomatic ties around the world. And countries would have to sort of deal with it, except that North Korea is in a corner of the world and it's sort of a security problem because of nuclear weapons. Iran is not in the corner of the world. It's in the middle of the world. It's the country's the Straits of Hormuz. They need to talk with it. I mean, you can have all these campaigns as, cut ties, don't invite them, don't bring them to the UN. But, even if they believe that they're total gangsters ruling over the country, well, what would you think? If you lived in a city and half of your city was run by a bunch of gangsters, you would have to talk to them after a while. So it tells you, I think, if you want to know my opinion, I don't think trying to lessen diplomatic ties of Iran or increasing sanctions, I don't think it's a smart move for the opposition. Because number one, whether countries in the world expand their ties or reduce their ties to the Islamic Republic, it won't be primarily because of the pressures of the Iranian opposition, because it doesn't have that kind of power in any country, right? Let's say the Iranian American community, if it was really together and organized and it could affect things, but I sort of have a piece coming out about this, but that's not really the case. What happens is the Iranian Americans attach themselves to others who have a goal for their own reasons, and they're used there as an alibi. And I don't think it's bad to have allies, right? You can, in politics, you can even have, mix for a strange bedfellows, as they say. But we'll be deluding ourselves if we think we can sort of affect the policy there. And it's not even clear that the regime being more isolated is better for by isolated, I mean having less diplomatic ties, right? It's not even clear necessarily that it's better for the opposition movement. And at any rate, even if it is better or worse, there are arguments on both sides. It's not the deal breaker. The deal breaker is building an organized, serious, credible alternative to the Islamic Republic. The deal breaker is organizing Iranians, building membership-based organizations that could really mobilize tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Iranians who can push things. These are what brings change, right? Unfortunately, Iranians, just like Palestinians, by the way, use the example of South Africa in the most silly, unserious way. Yes, it would be a great way to think about it. South Africa, some countries put sanctions on it. The apartheid regime was overthrown. They miss out, as I said, both Iranians and Palestinians and others actually do this. They miss out the parts that, South Africa had an organized opposition that went back to decades. The African National Congress, it had a serious presence everywhere. It had a very serious agenda. There were mass movements inside South Africa led by clandestine trade unions that brought up hundreds of thousands of people. And they had a very clear political strategy, which included, by the way, negotiations with the apartheid regime and a chance effect that you had a president of the apartheid regime who was so ready to sit down and talk. Yes, partly because of the sanctions, but obviously it takes something more than sanctions for someone like de Klerk to win a Nobel Prize with Nelson Mandela, to serve as vice president in his government, right? For Nelson Mandela to accept to be in the part of the same government as the party of the apartheid and to take part in these very important, tense negotiations that could have gone anywhere by the way. And of course, many people considered Mandela to be a traitor because of some of the things he gave up in those negotiations, but we forget those parts and we just have these easy images of the world that, oh, if only we put more sanctions. And I should say this is added also to the terrible tradition of Iranian conspiracies. I mean, this is a disease that really needs to be cured, right? There are Iranians out there, tons of them, perhaps millions of them. They seriously believe that 1979 was caused, because Carter stopped supporting the Shah, and now the regime is in power because they, and it's not clear who they is, they want it. This is a disease, as I said, and of course you can never make a change if you entirely believe that it's the outside powers who determine who is in your government and how's your life. You can never bring about change. So we need to counter that. We need to be less obsessed about the diplomatic engagements of the Islamic Republic and a little bit more concerned about what we in the opposition are able to do to increase our own power. And build up our own credible alternative to the regime.
So final thoughts on where we're going and where we are a year later?
I think a year later, as I said, it was a sobering moment that we found out despite the heroic sacrifice of our Iranian people, despite, more than 22,000 people were arrested and thrown into jail. Unfortunately, the Iranian political opposition basically doesn't really exist as an organized force. And this is the regime has survived for one reason. So I could say for two reasons. First, it's repression, right? Obviously, so it's sheer capacity for brutality, which brings the tenacity, right? Khamenei is not the kind of guy who gets on a plane and leaves. He will kill. He's the one who consoled Bashar Assad, a man who killed 600,000 of his own people, but he did keep the government, right? And that's the goal there. That's the number one reason. And so the number two reason is, as I've also said throughout this interview, that we have not yet built a credible alternative to the Islamic Republic. And if we wanted to change, that's the only way. There would be no there can be no overthrowing of the Islamic Republic without a credible, organized political alternative to be built to it. And I think last year showed that we didn't have it from before, it hurt, and we couldn't build it throughout the year. If we want to be ready for the next time, as there inevitably will be a next time of political protests and people coming out, we need to build that alternative.
Arash, you have a book out. Can you tell us more about that?
What Iranians Want, Woman, Life, Freedom is the title of the book. It comes out in February. And I wrote this book because, when we talk about Iran and when we talk about the movements there, we often sort of have a negative image, by which I mean we talk about how terrible the government is and how brutal the regime is. And of course, there's no doubt about any of that. But I wanted to write about the positive visions that Iranians have had. What are their demands? Why is it that Iranians come out time and time again, get killed in their hundreds? Thousands of Iranians have died in protest movements, in the years before, in the last couple of decades. Why is it that they risk their lives and they still come out? So I wanted to give a positive visions of let's say, the ecological movement in Iran, a movement against censorship, a movement for women's rights, a movement even for Afghan refugees, a movement for different foreign policy. So each chapter of the book really opens up one angle of Iranian demands, if you will, and Iranian movements. I'm born in 1988. Felt like I sort of owed it to my generation and that of after, a generation of people who have suffered nothing but defeats in a way. But they've never stopped struggling for a better Iran, and a struggle that I'm sure will go on. And I wrote this book to capture some of those demands of Iranians of, as I said, my generation and a few after.
And when's that out? In February, did you say? Right. brilliant. Well, I hope everybody purchases it and reads your previous books as well. Arash, thank you so much for joining us on bne IntelliNews.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.